Hey, what's up guys? Today, I'll show you a mystery thriller film, Department Q, The Keeper of the Lost Causes. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. The movie begins with a police investigator named Carl sitting in a car with two colleagues. Carl suddenly goes out and walks towards a house, so his colleagues follow him and remind him that they should wait for backup. However, Carl is stubborn and refuses to follow orders, so his colleagues have no choice but to follow him inside. The first thing they see is a fat guy with a gunshot wound on his head. After seeing that, Carl's colleagues tell him they should get back in the car and wait. Suddenly, a mysterious man appears out of nowhere and shoots them. The three policemen quickly fall onto the ground while the shooter flees. 3 months after that incident, Carl returns to work and talks to his boss. His boss informs him that he will be removed from the homicide department because of his stubbornness to abide by the rules and lack of leadership skills. Also, his other colleagues do not want to work with him because of his attitude. Then the boss says that there is a new department called Department Q. The department handles cases that have been unsolved for 20 years, and Carl's job would be to go through the cases to find any errors. It would be 3 years of work behind the desk, but Carl's boss tells him that he will have help from an assistant. Later that day, Carl visits his best friend who is paralyzed from the shooting incident that happened to them. Carl shares that his wife ended things with him after the incident, while his best friend expresses that he has lost hope of getting better, and he is just waiting for death. The following day, Carl goes to the new department and he meets his assistant, Assad. Assad warmly welcomes Carl and he says that he had taken the initiative to tidy up Carl's office. Assad says that he chose some cases for them to start with. However, Carl rudely says that sorting out unsolved cases is a job for people near retirement. Assad dismisses Carl's attitude. He informs Carl to choose a case and he leaves after. Carl looks at the posted pictures on the wall and a case about a female victim catches his attention. Following that, Carl starts to reinvestigate the case with Assad's help. The case happened 5 years ago, and based on the report, the victim went on a ferry with her mentally disabled brother and committed suicide by jumping from it. However, the victim's body was never found. Carl does not believe that the victim would go on a ferry with her brother and commit suicide for no reason. Then the scene transitions back to the day before the victim's disappearance. The victim was an important member of the Parliament Department, and at home, she was a loving sister to her brother. Then the scene transitions back and forth between the present day and the events before the victim's disappearance. Carl and Assad read the witness's statement about seeing the victim and her brother on a ferry. A witness saw them fighting on the deck, and after that, other witnesses saw that the victim was alone in the cafe, while a man saw the brother with a guy in a dark raincoat. Then the victim went to the container parking lot and she found her brother there. The victim walked towards her brother, and suddenly the man in the dark raincoat came out and put his handkerchief doused with chloroform over the victim's face. Right then, the victim lost consciousness. Seeing that, the brother repeatedly pounded the car in front of him. Afterward, the victim woke up in a dark room and immediately worried about her brother. The victim pounded on the door and windows, but no one answered until a bright light enlightened the room. Then a man's voice informed the victim that she was inside a pressure chamber. There were 2 buckets on the floor for food and toilet, and she was told they would be replaced every day using the hatch. The victim pleaded to let her out, but the man refused and increased the pressure by 2 atmospheres, which caused pain to the victim. After that, the light went out, while the victim had no choice but to endure the pain. Later that day, Carl meets up with another detective that handled the victim's case. Carl rudely asks about the case, so the detective leaves him without answering. The following day, Carl and Assad go to the nursing home where the victim's brother is staying. On the way to the dining room, the psychiatrist informs them that the brother got into a car accident when he was 8 and that provoked brain trauma, which is the leading cause of his current mental state. The brother lost his parents that day and cannot accept that it happened. After his sister's disappearance, his condition worsened. Then the psychiatrist warns them that if they ever upset the brother in any way, there is going to be a problem. Carl then sits with the brother, while Assad stays at the door to observe them. Carl immediately asks him a series of questions. However, the victim's brother does not even look at Carl because he dislikes new voices. Carl persistently instructs him to look and talk to him, but he remains unmoved, so Carl and Assad had no choice but to leave the place. The following day, Carl and Assad visit a man who was once involved with the victim. The man worked in the government and he had a secret relationship with the victim, even though he was married. The man is confused why the victim's case was reopened, but Assad and Carl refuse to tell him why. Later that day, Assad decides to visit the victim's brother alone to get to know him better. On the other hand, Carl meets up with the victim's former secretary at a bar. Carl asked about the men in the victim's life because he theorizes that someone close to the victim committed the crime. So the former secretary shares that a month before the victim disappeared, the victim got involved with a man while they were at a Congress gathering in Sweden. Then the scene transitions to the victim counting her days in the pressure chamber. Every day, the victim cites the date, her name, and her brother's, and she reminds herself that she can survive. The man congratulates the victim for surviving, and he increases the pressure again, which causes pain to the victim. Back to Carl and Assad, Carl shares the information he got from the victim's former secretary, and he instructs Assad to get the list of participants from the Congress gathering. Within that day, Carl and Assad receive the list of participants, but they are by invitations and pictures. They quickly get into work and sort out the invitations using the participants' gender. After that, Carl calls the hotel management and asks for the event's pictures. Assad consistently visits the brother so that he can soon recognize his voice. Afterward, Carl and Assad sort out the photos and they focus on the ones where the victim talks to men. Following their investigation, Carl's boss confronts him about the recent phone calls he received. It turns out that the nursing home complained about Carl's rude behavior. The men he confronted about the victim asked why the case was reopened, and the accounting department received a massive bill of an order of the event's pictures. The boss scolds Carl because of his stubbornness and instructs him to close the case and file a report about it. Later that day, Assad brings the event's photographs to the victim's brother, while Carl waits outside the room because the brother dislikes him. Assad reminds the brother not to be upset when he sees the victim, then he shows him the pictures. He refuses to look at them, so Assad convinces him until he finally looks at them one by one. They finish the first batch of pictures, so Assad stands up to take another one. Assad hears him slowly panicking, and Assad sees him looking at one photograph of his sister with a man. Assad quickly grabs it and realizes that the brother recognizes the man's face because it is the same man in the raincoat from the ferry. The brother continues to breathe heavily, and suddenly he attacks Assad. The nurses immediately go inside to calm the brother. Following that, Carl and Assad go through the images one by one until they finally match the photographs. Then they search for the written name on the invitation from the list, and they discover that the man's name is Daniel. The scene transitions back to the victim, who now looks thin and older. The victim suffered from a toothache, so the man gave her a pair of pliers through the hatch. Without anesthesia, the victim painfully takes out her tooth, which causes bleeding. The victim sees the blood and spreads it on the window, which angers the man. The man instructs the victim to clean it, but she refuses. The man increases the pressure until the victim finally cleans the window. Back to the investigation, Assad drives to Sweden, while Carl is on the phone talking about Daniel. Suddenly, the person on the phone informs Carl that Daniel drowned in a boating incident just after the victim's disappearance. After that, Carl and Assad meet an officer in a boat lesser. The officer has a folder about the victim's case, so Assad scans it while Carl interrogates the lesser. Suddenly, Assad calls Carl's attention because of a photograph of an unknown person. The officer informs them that the chubby man in the picture is Daniel. Carl shows the image to the officer and lesser, but neither of them knows the chubby man. After that, Carl leaves and scans the folder. Shortly after, Assad realizes that the man in the raincoat disguised as Daniel to get into the gathering, and then he kills the real Daniel 6 months later. Then the two realize that the fake and real Daniel knew each other. Minutes later, the officer informs them that Carl's department told him Carl and Assad are not allowed to investigate in the area. As expected, Carl refuses to give the folder, but the officer is persistent, so Carl takes a few pages and hides them before getting the folder back. After that, Carl and Assad go to a storage room to talk to Daniel's partner. Carl informs him that Daniel may have been involved in the victim's case. Then Carl shows the picture of the fake Daniel, and the partner tells that it is a man named Lass who grew up with Daniel at an orphanage. Then, as expected, there are police waiting for them outside. The scene then transitions to the victim cursing the man. The man tells the victim that he will turn on the lights outside for half a minute so the victim can see him. The victim slowly walks towards the window and is shocked to see Lass's face. The victim reminisces about her moments with Lass, and it angers her because it turns out that she has known her kidnapper all along. Back to Carl and Assad, Carl's boss castigates reckless actions and rude behavior, so he decides to suspend Carl and Assad. Later that day, Carl goes to Assad and tells him that he needs to know what happened to the victim. Assad agrees and shares the orphanage where Lass grew up to continue investigating. The following day, they visit the orphanage, and one of the workers says that Lass was violent as a child, and only Daniel hung out with him. Then another worker looks up Lass's file and finds that Lass has been living with his disabled mother. It turns out that Lass's family got into a car accident that left his father dead and her mother disabled. That results in Lass ending up in the orphanage. On their way to Lass's house, Carl reads Lass's file, and it reveals that the victim and Lass got involved in the same car accident that killed their parents. Then, a flashback shows two cars running on the road. The little boy Lass, with his family in a car, sees the victim in another car putting her hands on her mother's eyes as a joke. Then the victim went to her dad to do the same, but a truck crashed into them, causing the two cars to flip over. After that, Lass woke up to see his family dead. Then he saw the victim unscratched in front of him and even enjoying the snow day, which angered him. After that incident, Lass was taken from her mother's home because she could not take care of him. Then the orphanage gave Lass to his first family, who ended up sexually abusing him. So Lass ran away from them, and he got back to the orphanage where he met Daniel. Other kids bullied them, but Lass stood up to them, which caused Daniel to like him. Fast forward to the now grown-up Lass. He was at work when he saw the victim's face in the news, which triggered painful memories. Thereupon, Lass planned everything from seducing the victim, using her brother to kidnap her, and then killing Daniel. Back to the present, Lass sees Carl and Assad pull up in front of his house, so he leaves before they can see him. Meanwhile, Carl and Assad go into the house to talk to Lass's mother. As expected, the mother lies to them and says that Lass has not been home. So Carl and Assad go out, but not to leave but to investigate the place because they suspect that Lass's mother lied to them. Then Carl and Assad find a locked storage room. Meanwhile, Lass goes to the victim to remind her that she is the reason why he lost his father and sister. After that, Lass increases the pressure in the chamber room and leaves the victim to die. On the other hand, Carl tries to open the storage but fails, so he starts to walk away to get something from his car. Suddenly, Lass comes out in front of Carl and he immediately reveals that Lass is a suspect and asks him to go to the police station with them. Lass calmly agrees, but Carl sees tons of petrol containers, so he instructs Assad to turn around the car. Lass hurts Carl and stabs Assad, then he runs back to the barn. Even though dizzy, Carl goes back and finds a room full of Lass's plan. Shortly after, he finds the pressure chamber that the victim is in. Carl quickly calls for backup as he turns off the pressure and calls out the victim. Suddenly, Lass comes out and strangles Carl. Carl slowly suffocates, but luckily, Assad follows them and he beats Lass with a metal tube. Assad and Carl fall onto the ground while the victim continues to shake because of the pressure. Moments later, help finally arrives. Following that, the nurse informs them that the victim is responding to depressurization and it will take time for her to get better. Then the nurse accompanies the brother to his sister's room. The film ends with Carl and Assad getting their badges back, but Carl refuses to return to the homicide department because he wants to handle the department queue with Assad and his secretary to do the paperwork. He ends up being content with his current job, which is supposed to be a punishment. This is Daniel CC Movie Channel. Stay safe and enjoy your day.